Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. In this episode, I have a wide ranging conversation with Zahra Haider on patriarchy in South Asia, particularly Pakistan, its connections with colonialism and imperialism, feminist resistance in South Asia against patriarchy, as well as patriarchy in the West and its connections to capitalism more broadly. Zahra Haider is a multidisciplinary artist from Islamabad, Pakistan. Her work explores state fractures, otherness, nationalism, and identity, particularly in relation to Pakistan and its diaspora. She has been featured on BBC, CNN, Vice, and more, sparking conversations on class, gender, sexuality, and gender-based violence, as well as women's trauma in Pakistan. You can read her newsletter Zero Point on Substack or listen to her podcast Armpit Intellectuals. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to subscribe and like this video. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review to get this podcast to new audiences. Of course, you can and should please share this podcast with others in your life. Word of mouth makes a huge difference. Lastly, if you're able to contribute small amounts of money or would like to be a monthly donor to help the sustainability of this show, you can do that on Patreon. I've left that linked in the description, in addition to other links where you can find us on Instagram and Substack. All right, here's my conversation with Zahra. Okay, Zahra, welcome to the International Solidarity Podcast. Thank you for being here. We're trying to cover a whole bunch of ground as we were, discussing before I hit record. Um, yeah, let's see what we can get through. You have, written on your Substack, your project Zero Point, about a whole bunch of things related to patriarchy, colonialism, gender, diaspora, these kinds of things. You have a very interesting article on shame economies, particularly as it relates to, women in South Asia, but I assume that the problem is broader than that. Maybe get us started with how you think about what are shame economies, how does this work in South Asia, and give us a sense of what you've been trying to get at in your writing on this.
Uh, hi, Ashwin. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And that's a great question. So I start off that essay with a quote from Carl Jung, which is basically that shame is a soul-eating emotion. And I think that it's definitely related to my own personal experiences of growing up as a woman in South Asia, in Pakistan. Um, Albeit there's definitely a difference in how class dynamics play out, especially when it is related to these shame economies. So I think, for example, it's also how shame is passed on through generations. I think it's safe to say that that's how it kind of starts off, is that when you're a young woman, for example. And I mean, this could apply to any gender, but to speak on women, I think it starts with growing up and feeling surveilled and policed and kind of accepting shame as something that's normal. It's almost like this third entity in the room with you when, even in front of like female relatives. It was something as simple as I remember just after puberty, and this didn't just happen to me, this happened to a lot of post-pubescent girls, I guess. But as soon as, like the silhouette of your chest forms, it's kind of like, oh, like, cover with a shawl, like don't let anybody like see the shape of your chest. So that's just one example of how early on shame was embedded in me. And I think there's a lot of shame as well, just around around the idea of genitals as well when we're children. I think that we're kind of conditioned to see our genitals as something unclean. Um, Even if we do clean them. So I think it's just these very early messages that integrate shame into us, like into the social conditioning. And I think that religion also plays a big part in this. I think Pakistan, that is predominantly Muslim, I guess, there are religious beliefs as well that do impact this. A lot of contorted religious beliefs. So I think that that's kind of a premise of how the shame economy kind of starts, you could say. And it's also about I mean in the diaspora too, you can see how this plays out because a lot of people also hold on to uh their kind of ideals, even if they come to the West. So I know, for example, women who have been shamed for being quote unquote too westernized. I think that's a really popular trope that gets thrown out a lot that, women who've been punished, who've been, killed for being too free or too westernized. Excuse me, across South Asia, right? This is even in the diaspora, actually, like there have been women who've been killed by their families for that reason. So I think these are just some examples to kind of get into it. And, in Pakistan as well, we talk about it a lot. The same way that I think economists talk about currency. Um, but I think that what's really important to note is that
Is it being like honor, right? Roughly
yes.
translating to
Thank you.
honor. Yeah. Sorry,
Yes.
continue.
Sorry. No, no, no worries. Yes. Is honor. But that currency of Izzat is always paid by women. So,
Yeah, that's interesting because that actually, if we could tease this out a little bit more, that's actually where I was, going next is, you've talked about shame, some of the, well, I guess we'll get into sort of, the origins of it, what does it have to do with perhaps the class structure, or, you know, we've established the connection with patriarchy, but what does patriarchy have to do more broadly with the class structure, with, how economies, are set up and, what that has to do with colonialism. I think that's a little bit down the line in our conversation. But do you think you could, maybe tease out a little more, with you've talked on shame, but the economy side of it, that sort of implies, and you're saying is that there's a kind of, currency that kind of implies that there are, maybe for lack of a better term, transactions in shame going on between, in within the family unit, between family units, between members of families. Patriarchy, is a system, held up by men and primarily benefiting men, but not exclusively, right? It's held up by women, other family members,
mhm.
sort of across age and these other kinds of boundaries. So what is the economy, I guess, of shame and how does that work? I mean, just, if you had some brief thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think how you mentioned that, yes, patriarchy is, of course, primarily upheld by men, but it is equally as upheld by women, definitely. And I think that in South Asia, for example, that is seen in how the wedding industrial complex is perpetuated, for example. I mean, there are a lot of women who, I'll use an example in Pakistan. This is kind of like a sociocultural reference, but there are a lot of women who are essentially conditioned from a very young age that their main purpose in life is to get married, have a decent rishta, have children, and that's really about it. So a lot of their so-called upbringing is focused on being this marriageable woman. And I think that that is part of this shame economy because it emphasizes on a woman that her worth is to her that her worth lies in being marriageable. Um, and a lot of women in Pakistan a lot of women have, pursued higher education. They've trained as doctors. They've gotten their MBBS degrees. And it's kind of like an epidemic where there are so many trained female doctors who aren't in the workforce because they're just kind of getting married then and having children and not really utilizing the education. It's more of a way to seem more attractive, I guess, more quote unquote profitable in the so-called economy that wants to buy women in this way. So I think that's an example. And another one is perhaps this is more predominant in the West, but there's a German philosopher, Byung-Chul Han. I'm very fond of his work. Um, and he talks about the optimization, like optimization politics, how we're so, as a society, hyper focused now on optimization, aestheticization, and just an example of that would be like, just going to the gym for aesthetic reasons, not to necessarily strengthen your body, but to have an aesthetically fit body, to look aesthetic. And the same thing with a lot of young women who are, investing in, I guess, like preventative Botox and cosmetic surgery and all of this to kind of appease a certain gaze. So shame is profitable. I mean, if we take another example in South Asia, for example, sorry, an example in South Asia, is how popular Fair and Lovely, which is now called Glow and Lovely, became. It literally profited off of women's insecurity that reigned from colonialism, of being darker skinned, that was not acceptable. And that, Fair and Lovely was extremely profitable, in the subcontinent. I mean, my grandmother still uses it, like it's shocking, honestly, like how many years she's probably been using this. So I think these are just some more tangible examples of how the shame economy really plays out, particularly for young women, for South Asian women, even for men, right? So yeah, I think just to kind of touch upon that.
Great, thank you for that, Zara. Um, yeah, I'm trying to, see where we can go from here, but you touched on colonialism. Maybe we'll go there and um, you know, in your work you've sort of looked at colonialism, its role on, the body, and we can even talk about how it shaped patriarchy in South Asia in a particular kind of way. Um, I guess I'm just opening it up here. You sort of talked about one aspect of it, that is sort of the at the more cultural level, sensibilities about, skin color, that kind of thing. Give us some of your perspectives and thoughts on how, colonialism, European colonialism, British colonialism in South Asia, has shaped the form that patriarchy takes today, and to what extent that this form of patriarchy existed before colonialism. Yeah, just I guess we're getting a sense here of how colonialism is shaping patriarchy in South Asia today. Broad, I know, but yeah, just feel free to dial in on, whatever aspect you've written about or that you've thought predominantly about.
No worries. Yeah, great question. I don't mind that it's broad at all. I mean, there are quite a few different factors to look into this. I think if we look at some early examples, one of the earliest examples I can think of is when the British first went to India. I can't remember exactly when, but I know that there were women in the south of India who were donning saris without blouses. And that kind of, hit the British, like the colonizers, quote unquote, idea of civility and like, this is inappropriate. And historically, colonizers, wherever they colonized, um, there's always this binary of civilized, them being the civilized ones and the colonized being the barbaric savages, essentially. So, um, like if we take it into this consideration, the British are the ones who regulated sexuality, who pushed for the nuclear family model, who wanted to, I guess, police sexuality in that way, especially because in India at the time, there was a lot more sexual fluidity, even in the Mughal courts. There was they just saw the Mughals, for example, as being effeminate. So there was this very patriarchal image already of how they saw Indians, for example, if we take that into consideration. So I think that seeing that, that's kind of how colonization played into early patriarchy in India. And I think after that, another example actually is how Khwaja Sira, so hijras, or quote unquote, what they saw as cross-dressers, um, how that was criminalized. Hijras who had been, I guess, if we were to translate that into English, I guess, in folks of a third gender, you could say. They had been around for a very long time. They were, celebrated in society. They were seen as a symbol of luck at weddings, all of these things. And then the British decided that this is, inappropriate. This doesn't fit our values as a very civilized, rational society or people. So we're just going to criminalize the existence of these people. And I think that these so-called laws of theirs have affected society for, decades, centuries after. Um, and there's also an air, even if we look at, indigenous colonization in Canada, um, indigenous societies here were predominantly matriarchal in the sense that women were kind of, the heads of the village in that way. And when the colonizers came, they kind of tried to manipulate the men against the women by, berating them and saying that, oh, you're just, you're not, like patriarchal ideals, I guess, of trying to turn men against women, of trying to also embody patriarchy. And I guess the same thing happened in India, where not only was it genders were turned against each other, but also, different religious identities were turned one against each other. Um, so I think those are just some early examples, particularly related to gender. And then, of course, feudalism has persisted in South Asia, especially in Pakistan. I think, India still has, and Bangladesh as well, they still have some, they're a bit more capitalistic, you could say, than Pakistan. Pakistan is still very much a feudal state and has not really progressed to capitalism. Um, and I think that, feudalism is also a carryover of colonialism, because patriarchy started with feudalism. And I mean, it didn't start with feudalism, but it kind of, was cemented in by feudalism in Europe, and serfdom and all of these things. There's a feminist theorist, Sylvia Federici. She talks about this in her book, Caliban and the Witch. So that's definitely something to read if you're interested in the origins of patriarchy in medieval Europe. Um, so yeah, I think that feudalism is definitely something that's still very much rooted in our colonial past, and it's very prevalent in Pakistan, and that again, there's feudalism in the diaspora as well. Feudal lords don't have the same power here, but again, that mentality kind of proceeds in the community. Um, and I think that also there have been some health studies as well. I wrote an essay called The Colonial Gut about how I believe that a lot of my chronic health issues are related to intergenerational trauma and things like that, especially if I trace my family's health history. Um, it's well known that now that a lot of what happened during the famines that were again um, part of colonial violence or yeah, colonizers were responsible for that. Um, that has resulted in, generations of health issues, particularly diabetes, heart disease. And that's a very known fact now. But I think that when it comes to women, for example, because our, bodies are, they, of course, we are affected by diabetes and heart disease as well. But I think there's definitely a phenomena of metabolic syndromes among South Asians. So particularly for South Asian women, there's a very large percentage of women who develop polycystic ovarian syndrome or polycystic ovaries, which is essentially a metabolic syndrome. So basically, like 200 years of survival and just subjugation and communities going against each other when they had lived in relative harmony for a very long time. And so much displacement trauma. I mean, my grandmother is originally from India, from Agra. So, she doesn't really like to talk about what happened during partition. She was quite young, but she still remembers the trauma of fleeing and all of these things. And she's had a number of health issues, more than any of my other grandparents who, were born in what is now known as, the nation state of Pakistan. But she being the migrant, Muhajir, she has more health issues than anybody else in my family. And I find that really fascinating. I mean, it's obviously, it worries me, but it's also very interesting that given that she has had more accumulative trauma in a way than the rest of my family members, she has more health issues.
Yeah, that is indeed very interesting. And, I guess just going back to talking about, the feudal kind of power structures in South Asia. I mean, I take your point that Pakistan, there is like a difference, I guess, between Pakistan and India and even Bangladesh. But feudal structures still very much exist in India. And we've had discussions on this on the podcast before, to the extent that those have been reduced and eliminated, I guess, or contested. It's largely in pockets here and there due to left movements, the communist movement, which, largely is was looking to, redistribute land, that kind of thing, versus the the constituency of the dominant party in India, the Indian National Congress, really relied on, support from, from these feudal lords to hold up their to sustain them in power. And then, of course, listeners might remember that in our one of our previous episodes with Radhika Desai, she was talking about how, um, for countries to develop, at least typically how it's proven to be done in non imperialist countries, white settler colonial or white colonial, basically the European core countries that have used imperialism to develop themselves. The way other countries have developed is to, shift their resources from the agricultural sector, which again in South Asia is largely dominated, or has a feudal kind of or semi-feudal kind of setup, to divert those resources, or to use the resources from the agricultural sector to support and develop an industrial kind of sector, a more urban centered, form of development. This is the form of development that China and the Soviet Union and, other countries that have developed in recent memory from, being quote unquote backwards to, somewhat industrially developed. That's the model they've used. But, in the case of South Asia, when the you know the 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 basis for legitimacy of the Indian National Congress, at least in the case of India, is the support of these feudal lords, then that development, like, it's out of the question that it can even take place. And that sort of, you know, explains the continued kind of underdevelopment, at least in India, but it's very similar across South Asia. So that is, sort of just a point that I wanted to make. And of course, under feudal conditions, or feudal social relations, there's like a disproportionate burden on women doing labor on the land. And again, this goes into affecting health. And then what is once you have these health problems, even for diaspora, right? Like diaspora like us, right? Even when you do have these health and that do come from privileged backgrounds in South Asia, what is sort of the healthcare access, right, to remedy these things, both in South Asia as well as elsewhere? I mean, uh, it, I guess a discussion on how the healthcare system is set up under capitalism, both in the industrialized centers, or the imperial core economies versus the peripheral economies. That's a separate discussion, but yeah, those are real healthcare discussions. And then again, maybe last point, sorry, I've been going on for a while now, is that to the extent that these gender imbalances and the more wretched forms of patriarchy have been moved away from or abolished. And again, I'm thinking within India, it is through these left movements. And again, we've touched on this, redistributing land. I mean, in one of these episodes that we did, the of the Maoist movement, like almost half of the guerrilla forces, I guess, are women. And that's not some aesthetic thing to marvel at, even though it can be. But it's a matter of survival, and it's a matter of, it's reflective of who these economic structures and societal structures are impacting, and thus who is taking agency into their own hands to do something about it, right? um, yeah, sorry, that was a lot. Um, so maybe, we were talking about, and, feel free to add to anything I've just said, but since I was talking just about, women's involvement in, liberation movements, maybe we can move to talking a little bit more about feminist resistance in South Asia. Um, I think you pay particular attention to the feminist movement in Pakistan. If someone isn't familiar with the feminist movement in Pakistan, or the movement for women's liberation in Pakistan, um, you know, what would be a primer? How has this evolved over time? What is its relationship to the state and to, I guess, capitalism and feudalism? And yeah, feel free to comment on anything I said previously as well if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, what you said, that was a great point. Of course, it's still definitely prevalent in India, and I imagine, vast majority of the subcontinent, or all of the subcontinent. Um, and I think that, yeah, it's kind of like a hierarchy. It's kind of like a chain of command, because I think that a lot of voters, for example, who are under the power of a feudal lord, for they kind of have to do as he says in a way. So when it comes to voting or elections, it's kind of like, do or die situation. So I definitely think that plays a large influence on how feudalism still, I guess, shapes politics a lot. Um, and I think, relating to your second question that you asked, um, feminist movements in, I guess, yeah, I guess particularly in Pakistan, which is, where I have the most knowledge. There's a vast history of feminist resistance movements across South Asia, and I wish I knew all of them, but I know that during, like you were talking about the female guerrilla fighters, that obviously should not be, glamorized, but I know that in Bangladesh, during the Bangladesh Liberation War, there were also female resistance fighters, armed female resistance fighters against the Pakistan army during that. And I think that's also an interesting part of history, like how these histories intersect, because essentially what happened during the Bangladesh Liberation War was, it was essentially a repudiation of what happened during partition, like what the Pakistan army did to Bangladeshi intellectuals and civilians and so on. So there was a particular, Hindu women were particularly targeted in particular. Actually, there's a documentary on it. I'm forgetting the name, but it showcased interviews with elder Hindu Bangladeshi women who were speaking about the atrocities that these Pakistani soldiers committed against them. And there's also a culture of denial and a culture of silence. So I remember when I shared this documentary on my social media, a lot of Pakistani commenters, I guess, who were a tad bit nationalist, they were going on to say how this is propaganda and it's just to make, our government look bad, and our government that has never formally apologized for this, atrocity. I mean, it was essentially a genocide, really. So yeah, I think it's interesting to I wanted to showcase that feminist resistance movement first, I guess, because that is still, it is still in relation to our history, and one that is not talked about enough or even um, acknowledged by the Pakistani state at all. So, but I think in terms of other feminist resistance movements, there is a movement. I actually wrote about this and did a podcast episode on this, but there was a movement, also a Maoist inspired movement, Marxist Maoist inspired movement, if that started in the 80s in Sindh, which is you could say it's a minority ethnicity in Pakistan. It's so in Pakistan, how the power structure plays out is that Punjab there is essentially the center where all the power lies. It's called the center, the establishment, where the military headquarters is, all of this stuff, because Pakistan is a military state. So anything that falls out of the periphery of Punjab is not really considered equal. It receives less funding, less resources, all of this. So in the 80s, there was a group of women from rural Sindh who formed this movement called the Sindhiani Tehreek. And they organized and excuse me, they went to the streets. They, some of them were arrested. It was, and a lot of it was to do with, I guess, how the center was trying to take up resources, take up land, take up, you know, uh, the how the river functioned, and they just, fought for their rights, and they were essentially um, a yeah, just they were just, they were essentially practicing Marxism without knowing what Marxism was. So I think that that's a very recurring theme from feminist resistance movements in Pakistan. It's this, it's very grassroots. There's this misconception, I think, that you have to, be in academia to like understand what Marxism is, but time and time again, from what I've seen and what I've researched, that's definitely not the case. So that's just an example. And I guess in more contemporary times, there is a very popular march. It's called the Aurat March, which is literally just the Women's March. And that takes place every year on International Women's Day since 2018, which was the first year it took place. And it received some criticism because it's organized by elite women. So Pakistan's class structure is very, it's very, there's this elite class that takes, it's almost like, it's about like 13% of the country or something, but they have a lot of power over a lot of the country's resources and things like that. So while it does receive criticism because these privileged upper class elite women with connections and who are more westernized, it's not really spearheaded by by working class women, who aren't urbanized and things like that. But a lot of women do join the movement because, of course, Pakistan is a very patriarchal nation state. And, oftentimes women are these, I guess, more religious male figures and just, anti-women's rights activists. Like they'll appear at these marches and they'll throw stones. And, I think there's even incidents of BB guns and that kind of, violence that women are expressing that, they have rights, they have freedoms, they don't want to be stuck in the kitchen making rotis, like, um, they're autonomous beings and they're literally, getting abused out for it. They're getting stones and pellets, thrown at them. And so I think, yeah, the march itself it takes place in all the major cities in Pakistan, and it has become, um, you know, both a site of really beautiful collective action and solidarity, but also a site of like danger. Like, a lot of and a lot of men attend to and people of other genders, but a lot of, women are feeling really afraid, I guess, of attending now. But um, there was also a historical uh, trans march in 2018, I believe, and that was one of, I think, it's interesting because when it comes to Bajaseras, which I wouldn't really refer to as trans women, I think because they prefer to be referred to with their gender. Um, I think it's interesting that, the Pakistani government has flip-flopped a lot on their rights. They did acknowledge that they could put an X as their gender on their passports and identity cards, but then they also went back on that. And, there's a lot of flip-flopping, I guess, on how Khwajaseras are viewed in society. And as I was saying earlier, I think that relates a lot to um, how their existence was essentially criminalized by British colonizers.
That's great. I appreciate that. I maybe did want to expand a little bit more about on the Aurat March and some of the maybe tensions there, because you did mention that, this is largely led by what can be characterized as elite or at least middle class, women from urban centers, focusing on, urban issues, maybe, more limited to, the household or interpersonal gender dynamics. I'm not as much of an expert, so please correct me on these things. Please elaborate on them. Interpersonal things as opposed to maybe economic structures, right? And looking at the vast majority of working class women, a big portion of which in Pakistan, right, are actually under the extreme poverty line, right? Um, I'm not remembering the numbers. Please don't quote me on this, listeners. But if it's like, something like 40 something percent, I think either 40 to 60% is what I've heard, of people more broadly, not just women, are under the poverty line in Pakistan. And obviously, this is a big issue in South Asia more broadly, right? Trying to address extreme poverty. But yeah, I mean, maybe to start this out, like, what are some, because this Aurat March, if I'm not wrong, takes place every year, from what I gather. What are some of these the demands, or if they don't have particular demands per year, I guess what is the broader orientation? And then who is actually critiquing them? Are they being, sort of critiqued by others, middle class academic feminists for not being working class enough? Like, and otherwise, I'd be more interested in hearing what are some of the maybe more working class organizations' critiques of this. And then, at least in your view, where do you see space for some kind of synthesis or some kind of, being able to move forward? Because it's not that, I mean, often people might get stuck in this game of, oppression Olympics, right? But, ultimately issues exist, including for, upper class or middle class, whomever, right? But the central issue is that those issues can't triumph the other issues, and it's about, moving forward, right? Essentially, the economic basis of society in a lot of ways gives rise to patriarchy, which manifests differently across classes, right? And the problem is not, hey, let's focus on just one class's oppression, but it's getting to the root of things. Anyway, I'm going on for long, but yeah, take us from here. Maybe start out by, what are the Aurat March's orientation? What are their demands? What are their, yeah, political demands?
I mean, it's very basic. I mean, if you see how it's very different than, liberal mainstream white feminism in the West that emphasizes on sexual liberation and all of these things that I think now a lot of, racialized global South feminists have now realized that, how harmful this is, because it's actually just asking immigrants to assimilate to their idea of liberation, right? And it's almost like policing in a different way that, if you're not like this, if you don't embrace our idea of feminism in the West, which is so, open and liberation but it seems very hollow. So it's yeah, so their demands are absolutely nothing like that. It's really rooted in basic autonomy, basic dignity. There's definitely an epidemic of honor killings, Karo-Kari in Pakistan, and what the reported numbers, the statistics that are reported, because of course a lot of these things go unreported, a lot of these acts of violence, is around 1,000 cases a year that are reported, which is still quite a high number. Um, so there is definitely, as I was mentioning earlier too, is it becomes this, currency, right? Honor, is it? But it also becomes this justification for violence, for murder. Um, and, people confuse this act of violence as something that's only associated with, lower class, rural, uneducated, whatever, um, groups of people and communities, but that's, false. And I can say that because, I have, I'm very aware of instances of femicide that have occurred in the most, upper, echelons of society in Pakistan. So I think, the class issue is very delicate, and in the sense that, people have these biases of, what someone who's more educated, foreign educated, westernized, from the urban center is going to be more civilized. But it's also in relation to how does stress play out for these people, how does stress play out for the man in a village, in a non-urban rural, town that where he's literally the hierarchy is so violent and so um uh compact, I guess it adds so much, it's so tight, it adds so much pressure to a lot of people. And of course, under immense stress, people break. But I think that's definitely something to look at as well when we discuss like the class differences. But I think just to go back to the Aurat March questions, um, yeah, it's really just about basic dignity, like don't commit honor killings, like it's don't kill women, don't murder women, stop murdering women. I think that's a big one. Stop. There's also an epidemic of marital rape cases, because marital rape isn't criminalized um, in Pakistan's law. And again, that is related to religion because in Islam, there is this belief that religious scholars like to throw around a lot that a woman is obligated to perform sexual acts for her husband. So there's no legal, punishment for marital rape or proper recognition. So this tends to happen a lot, and I think a lot of women themselves aren't aware that this is this is rape because they're married, and they just assume that this is their duty to their husbands. So I think what Aurat March is trying to do is tackle these very just basic autonomy, for women of different classes, different social classes. That women don't want to be subjected to, making rotis or just, producing an infinite amount of children. Um, and when women, again, there are a lot of anecdotes about this, but essentially there have been a lot of cases where women have tried to assert their independence, their desire for economic freedom. Um, and, they'll either face violence in the form of, physically or emotionally, or and the family suffers because one provider isn't cutting it, right? Like they have children, there's a lack of family planning. So there's a lack of awareness around contraception, all of these things. It's not accessible, especially if they're in rural communities. It's not accessible at all. It's expensive, it costs money. Um, and yeah, so there's a lot of incidences where, women experience violence because, there's this idea that women should just be at home, making food with the children, and there's no place for a woman outside. And the state also supports this because it's interesting in the UAE, where I have also briefly lived before. Um, there is a labor system there. It is exploitative. It's called the kafala system, where they bring domestic laborers from, various, I guess, Southeast Asian, like the Philippines, India, Pakistan. So not Pakistan, sorry, Ethiopia, and Sudan. There are other countries as well. Um, and Pakistan does not have an agreement with the UAE government for this system. So a lot of women end up going without any government support, without any legal frameworks. They get a visa from an agent who sends them there to work for some, upper class Pakistani family in Dubai. But they don't have any protections if something happens, if they lose their job. And this is because the state itself, supports the fact that women should not be leaving the house to go and work, let alone a different country by themselves. So I think Aurat March really focuses on just these basic choices of autonomy. Nothing too frivolous, I suppose, like, how liberal Western mainstream feminism tries to. It's really it. I mean, the contrast is just shocking. It feels so tone deaf, Western feminism, honestly.
So then to what extent would you say that there's like, cross-class, I guess, interests, embodied in the demands of the Aurat March? And then maybe that's my first part of the question. And then what I was going to follow up with was, what are some of the, critiques of Aurat March, and where are they coming from? What are sort of the alternative visions that they present on the question of, uh, patriarchal oppression in Pakistan?
Mhm. Um, so yeah, so again, like the accusations of Aurat March being elite, and I think a lot of this does come from more religious, more even I guess like misogynistic male views. But it does also come from middle class feminists, right? Um, So I think where it comes from, the more patriarchal view is that it's, it challenges religious authority, it misrepresents religious authorities' demands, because there is an Islamic ideology council, Council of Ideology in Pakistan that makes a lot of, because the state is so intertwined with religion, it makes a lot of rules. Like in 2016, there was this big outrage at how this Council of Ideology permitted like lightly beating your wife. So these kinds of things take place. And so I think that in terms of other criticisms, it's mostly, yeah, it's mostly comes from this sort of like more right-wing viewpoint. But again, because class is such a sensitive issue in Pakistan that it's sometimes it's hard to really, to really work together when you're, someone who's, for example, working class and middle class and so aware of the class violence. I've witnessed that a lot. It just, there's a lot of, I suppose, like collective resent towards the privileged class because the class difference is so stark. It's so stark and it's so obvious to almost see, it's who is part of this privileged class and who isn't. It's that stark. So there is a lot of resent towards that. That it, it it's almost like when something is initiated by someone of privilege, something that's related to social justice or feminism or something. There's almost like a suspicion of what are the intentions here? What are the ulterior motives? So there's almost like a suspicion, I guess, like a suspicion that you can see in class dynamics, and definitely like a distaste, really. There's just a collective distaste towards towards the upper class. Um, but the Aurat March itself is definitely controversial. Um, I think on both ends of it. And I think there's also a question of like appropriateness, like what is appropriate? Again, this comes from the religious right about, a lot of the banners will have something, some after the first march, which was Mera Jism Meri Marzi, which is my body, my choice. And people found that vulgar, because they're like, the body is like the site of, why are you involving the body? Excuse me. So yeah, I think it just poses as a threat to family values and excuse me, public morality a lot. And I think that again, there is a bit of this. I mean, I'm just speaking from a personal anecdote really when it comes to this, but excuse me, as someone who, did grow up as part of this, upper elite class, like, and who's now working class and, in the West, it's a very different dynamic, of course, like, because if I go back to Pakistan, that privilege doesn't just leave you. And you are treated differently, and I can see that. I can see how violent it is. So I think there's always this question of whether, are these organizers really class conscious enough to be doing this? I think there's always a question of that, and that's where the suspicion lies, is that, are these just liberal feminists, in Pakistan who are just reproducing this idea of liberal feminism, or are they really like, using their privilege to uplift, marginalized voices as subaltern in society? Are they really using that, or are they just going to end up protecting themselves as well?
I wanted to ask a little bit more. Basically, I'm taking elements of, what you said in your previous response, but how, because, throughout the history of Pakistan, um, okay, I guess I'm going to try to combine two questions here, but and yeah, you can take it from there. But throughout the history of Pakistan, there have been, sort of different regimes in place where, the military comes in and I think if I'm not wrong, in the 70s onwards, my history is on, in terms of the timeline with Pakistan, it gets blurry here and there, but
Mm.
at some point, there was this greater influence of um okay, let's say, after independence when Pakistan was established, I think it was still contesting with perhaps the secularism of the Congress in India, and that and globally more broadly there was um a more secular flavor. You can say that that came from maybe the strength of the left globally, that kind of thing. But at a certain point there was a turn toward sort of more right-wing kind of religious influences coming from the Gulf, that kind of thing. Could you speak a little bit about, maybe I'll just start with this, but could you speak briefly about, what impact that's had on, how women's rights, and patriarchy more broadly has, how that's shaped Pakistan?
Definitely. I think this isn't just specific to Pakistan, but even if we look at Iran before the revolution and even Afghanistan, um, I think the regimes at the time were they kind of glorified Western values almost. So, you see all these photos that are circulated on social media, kind of like, oh, before the revolution, you see women in like dresses and things like that. It's just really interesting, right? Like how, it's just made to be such a binary. But I think that when it comes to Pakistan, it was similar in the sense that there were military regimes, really, like, since the inception of Pakistan, it was very much under military dictatorship. But at the time, there was more a sense of wanting to appease to the US, to the US imperialist gaze, I suppose. And then Bhutto came in, and people really championed for him. He was an agrarian. He was, center left leaning. He wanted to push for socialism. He nationalized a lot of private industries. Um, but he was essentially toppled over by Zia ul-Haq, who was, again, Bhutto was not in the military like the previous, his predecessor was Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan. They were both, uh, those were military regimes. And after Bhutto followed, he was followed by Zia ul-Haq, who had him hanged. And that was a very repressive military dictatorship in Pakistan's history. And that largely came from this borrowed ideology from Wahhabism, which is the predominant ideology in Saudi Arabia, religious ideology followed by Salafism. So, excuse me. So that what that looked like, I mean, that was those 79 to 88, those 9 years until his very mysterious assassination. Which occurred on a plane with the crate of mangoes. So there's a book by this writer Muhammad Hanif called A Case of Exploding Mangoes that kind of parodizes his has made his death into a parody. And it's banned in bookstores in Pakistan. But yeah, during that time, he adopted and implemented these very, patriarchal, religious laws, such as one of them was zina. So if somebody, was caught having sex outside of marriage or adultery, anything that kind of fell in that category, they were stoned to death. People were whipped and lashed, and as punishment, Um, and the death penalty was enforced a lot. I mean, it's still in place, but it was definitely much more enforced. I mean, in Saudi Arabia as well, there's been a long history of public hangings and flogging. So you could say that that ideology kind of, came to Pakistan. It was kind of transported, I suppose, during Zia al-Haq's regime. And another one actually that took place that was implemented that was extremely harmful that ended up putting a lot of women in jail was, they're called the Hudud ordinances. So one of those laws was that if a woman is sexually assaulted, she either needs to have four male witnesses, or the a person who committed the assault has to come forward himself. And if neither of these two things can happen, then she'll be put into jail for adultery. And that was very prevalent at that time. And, it's interesting because that was prevalent in Gulf countries up until maybe only a couple of years ago. Because I remember when I was in Dubai and I was in high school, I was hearing stories of like, oh, a Norwegian woman put into jail because she was sexually assaulted. So that really was, yeah. And I think that that really, seeped into kind of like the conditioning of society at that time. There were a lot of people who organized against this, a lot of women, a lot of, everybody, who saw this as deeply oppressive. And, um, it was a dictatorship, really. It was a religious dictatorship. But I think that it also affected the mentality of a lot of other people who felt that his actions, and his ideologies were justified. And that kind of seeped into the 90s, even after he was killed. Um, and you see how, that still lives on today. It's almost like there's resistance from a lot of, um, you know, I guess people on the right, especially like religious scholars or even women, women who are holding tightly to these Wahhabi, kind of religious ideals, um, that, society should be a certain way, very, very pro censorship. I mean, a little bit of censorship isn't a bad thing, but very pro censorship. And it's really rooted in purity culture, I think. And, just to root back to shame economies, I think that this idea of purity culture is a another currency of the shame economy, right? It's and especially when that's rooted in religious belief, religious practices. I mean, even like Pakistan's name, right? Pak means pure, like land of the pure, which is so ironic, every time I think about that. Um, so I think that, yeah, this idea of purity culture is really, it's really, it's like just get rid of filth from society, rather than seeing the nuance and all of that. I think that's very harmful.
Yeah, and it's interesting here that we mention the influence of uh, you know, th- this Wahhabism coming from Saudi, because, essentially the bulk of Pakistan's history, and this might be sort of shifting now, is has been, defined by this ironclad kind of relationship with the United States in the Cold War, against the left globally, against the Soviet Union. I mean, essentially, the way many people have characterized it is that Pakistan has sort of rented out its geopolitical or its geographic location, which is super strategic, next to Afghanistan, next to Iran, next to what was former the Soviet Union, um, and acted as a front line in the Cold War. This is how, you had, you wouldn't have essentially the military as strong of an institution as it is today without that history, without um, the influence of, US-led imperialism. Um, and, being put in that camp, the sort of the reactionary camp, I guess, in in the 20th century, I think also, is what fosters these connections, right, between the puppet regimes of U.S. imperialism, U.S.-led imperialism in West Asia, Saudi, the Gulf, these elite-led monarchies trafficking in, reactionary ideology. And so I guess what I'm doing here more broadly, and of course, that's not even to talk about you know, the wars that the U.S. has fought in with Pakistan as, the front line, and particularly the peripheral provinces in Pakistan in the West, right? And so what I'm really doing here is I'm sort of drawing, maybe I'm zooming out a little bit to draw the uh, the links, the relationship between, you know, imperialism and, imperialism as an outgrowth and manifestation of capitalism today, right? US-led imperialism, drawing connection between US-led imperialism and how that's impacted, women in South Asia and in Pakistan in particular, right? And in Central Asia, that kind of thing. Um, I guess there's more, there's always more to say about that, but maybe I'll use that as a transition, right? Since we're talking about, because it's rarely framed, the issues of patriarchy and gender and women's rights more broadly in, I guess, in Pakistan or in South Asia is not as connected always to U.S. imperialism, U.S.-led imperialism. Um, and then we were talking earlier about the role that, British colonialism has had in shaping patriarchy, that kind of thing. What I'm coming to here is sort of how, among, uh, I guess particularly among South Asian diaspora in the West, there's often this contrast between how, or this trope about how the West is very progressive on women's issues, that kind of thing. And certainly differences do exist, like don't get me wrong, and those are because of different histories, different developmental trajectories, all this kind of stuff. But it often, simply boils down to the West is more progressive on women's issues and the patriarchy essentially doesn't exist. A little bit of an exaggeration. The patriarchy doesn't exist in the West, unlike it does in South Asia, where it's very strong. This is an element of how backward we are. And again, I'm qualifying whatever I'm saying at every step because there is some elements of truth in there. I guess that's what we'll parse out, when I throw it back to you. But yeah, I mean, uh, and that obviously does not take into account the role that, first British imperialism, the role that British imperialism had on the subcontinent in, shaping patriarchy, as well as, US-led imperialism more broadly, even after in the post-independence era, and, how that impacts, women in South Asia. Um, so yeah, maybe some of your thoughts more broadly on, this dichotomy between essentially does patriarchy exist, Zara, in the West? Is what is this misconception, I guess, that we might have? And yeah, I'm just trying to get some of your thoughts on that, and then we'll unpack it.
Patriarchy definitely exists in the West, to answer your question. It just takes on different shapes and forms, I suppose, but it's definitely patriarchy is a global issue that has just kind of changed its shape with the advent of capitalism and globalization, especially. Um, I think because the West tries to, place itself as this progressive, like rational, kind of entity that, a lot of people have this misconception that, oh, the West isn't patriarchal, but that's really not true. It's just suppressed by this, and I think that also is kind of the colonizer archetype, right? It's like suppress, like, put on an air of rationality, just remain stoic, all of these things. So I think patriarchy in the West plays out in the same way. It's just suppressed and it tries to take on this face of stoic rationality. But there's definitely patriarchy here. And, I think here because, racism and Islamophobia and these kinds of racial and cultural discriminations are much louder that patriarchy kind of gets a bit more drowned out in the everyday, but that's, that's just circumstance. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Um, it definitely exists. I think it's just amplified by the fact that you're a brown woman or things like that. I mean, if you look at the the Canadian gender gap stats, the wage gap, at the bottom is I believe right at the bottom it is South Asian women and Black women and Indigenous women. Like these are the three most lowest paid groups in the Canadian so-called Canadian like labor force. Um, while the most well paid are at the top white men, and then I believe it's actually Asian women. Um, Asian women being East Asian women or Southeast Asian women. Just that's kind of how the stats are played out by race. So it's just interesting, so I think that that goes to show how much there is not only patriarchy, since racialized women are the least paid. And I've also experienced this discrimination personally in previous jobs. And even with writing, like being paid less than, someone I knew who was white, for example. There is this nature of exploitation, and even in the nonprofit industry, for example, there's this well-known trope of the woman of color, at the workplace, in any workplace, really. But the fact that it even happens in the nonprofit space, I mean, there's a nonprofit industrial complex, of course. So there's just this, this unconscious bias that precedes, there's a lot of racist microaggressions, all of these things, and that gets compounded by the fact that you're a woman, I think. So I think, yeah, just to answer your question, yes, patriarchy definitely exists in the West. And I really liked how, you drew on US imperialism after, we had discussed British colonialism. And of course I agree, like Pakistan had a direct role in that. And, Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, worked directly with the CIA to train Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan during the Soviet era. And how they procured funding for that training was by, selling opium. Um, and now you have this, like, mass substance use, of heroin, like, this epidemic of just deaths related to heroin, overdoses related to heroin. Because of this was the root of that, of opium overdoses and things like that. So, and how does that, I mean, that is patriarchal, of course. You're literally killing people to fund, like to fund fighters for a war. And I think, those people who have died from heroin overdoses include women, or women who lost their partners to substance use and were not able to provide for the household in the same way given the economy and things like that. So I think, yeah, that's why the world is so patriarchal, right? Like, because that act itself is an act of patriarchy, it's violence. I think anything that is oppressive and violent and lacks empathy and remorse and any kind of, care for others is patriarchal. Um, I mean, war itself is patriarchal. What's happening in Gaza and in Palestine is pure. It's just pure patriarchy. I mean, if you look at, even if you look at nuclear missiles, like they're shaped like penises. It's so phallic, like like it's just, I don't know. It's really, when I look at the world this way, I suppose, a lot. Um so yeah, and I think that in relation to US imperialism, I mean, it's interesting again that the most drone attacks, on Pakistan, on civilians, was during the Obama era, which is really interesting because again, there was this false false conception, misconception, you could say, of, oh, Obama, like he's racialized, he's this, he's a Democrat. But the most violence, on civilians was during his presidency, not Trump's. And I find that really interesting. Um, so I think again, like, and of course that's patriarchal. I mean, so many, innocent women were killed, so many innocent people, let alone women. Villages were destroyed. People were living in fear, constant fear. And that of course has affected a lot of the world. This the United States' violence, and just this strange lust for power, weapons of mass destruction, all of these things. So
Yeah, I guess I wanted to comment on a bunch of things that you mentioned about, patriarchy in Gaza, that's interesting because that also shows sort of the racialized dimensions of patriarchy as well. And patriarchy, like this model of patriarchy as being men suppress women irrespective of context with no broader understanding of, broader dynamics relating to capitalism. How did capitalism evolve? How did capitalism need imperialism to evolve? It shows, I think that case comes very clear in the Gaza situation where, you know, there is a gendering of, Palestinian men as well, right? Not even to, of course it is established that there's extreme levels of colonial violence um, on Palestinian women. We saw the horrendous images and pictures of, these Israeli, uh, you know, uh, colonial stormtroopers, parading around in women's lingerie, this kind of thing. And that's not even to talk about, sexual violence, that kind of thing. But apparently, it's okay when Palestinian men are raped, sexually abused, degraded as, Hamas militants, and that being a justification for genocide, essentially. And that shows that there is patriarchy is also racialized, and um, that in this racialization you get the Palestinian man and Palestinian men as a gendered subject as well, right? Inflected through colonialism and imperialism. So I just wanted to comment on that. As for patriarchy in the West, I mean, you pointed out some great examples, right, about the pay gap, right, and people who are at the lowest end of that pay gap are racialized women and indigenous women, and you know, this is again, I maybe just wanted to hone down on this because I don't think this gets talked about in these terms, but to think about patriarchy in the West, you can maybe think about it both in sort of the economic sphere and then the cultural
mhm,
sphere. And in the economic sphere, okay, it's I don't think it's controversial to say that most of these developed, um, so-called developed, Western industrial core economies, they don't they run they're called imperialist countries and imperialist economies for a reason, right? Much of their labor force these days in the neoliberal era has been outsourced to populations from the global south, right, through immigration. So you go to any country or most countries in the West, the lowest jobs, lowest category jobs, menial jobs, but essential, vital sectors of the economy are, done by, people from the global south, other parts of the world. In Canada, you can think of, I mean, there's been you know, great levels of immigration from Punjab, from India more broadly, through, the international student kind of economy. And, these international students are simultaneously working and contributing to fundamental sectors of the Canadian economy, trucking, logistics, food services, and accommodation, you name it. In the US, they largely source their vital labor force from Latin America. In Europe, you can think about their sourcing, their vital sectors of their economy, in the form of labor from Africa, from West Asia, from Turkey, that kind of thing. And among these racialized populations, the average, if you do statistical analysis of some sort, I would wager the average working class person is a racialized woman from the global south, right? In all of these cases across the West. So, I mean, that I think blows through the myth of, patriarchy not existing, and we're more progressive on gender and all this. I mean, this is only if you consider the bounds of the West as being, white women, from middle class background and above, that kind of thing. Completely false. That's the economic sphere. In the cultural sphere, I think it's maybe a little bit more blatant, or I'm not sure. Uh, you know, people might have different thoughts on this, but in music, in media, for quite a while now, I mean, this has just been surrounded by, the commodification of women, this like this outsized emphasis on sexuality. And I mean, most songs, right, are about love or about sex or about both. And there's a reason for that, right? Like music as an art forms can, I guess, very easily become political and, sites of real contestation uh, relating to, people's real lives, social issues, et cetera, et cetera. So those who, the power centers of the music industry, the power centers of the art and cinema industry, have sort of a vested interest in. I'm thinking particularly of music here to make all songs about love and romance, and that's not to say that songs about love and romance aren't they've existed throughout human history. They're very important, but this outsized focus on that, and then you think of, I mean, I don't know if I'll get flack for this, but uh, this this normalization of sort of uh, obtuse kind of sexual fetishes, and some people might not think foot fetishes are obtuse, whatever. I'm not commenting on that, but what you do see there is sort of normalizing the cutting up and commodification of new frontiers, I guess, of women's bodies that are then being commodified, where, now, I mean, this is obviously not the case for all women, but with some women, if there happens to be a photo where your foot is in there, people, will cover it up, right? Because, again, that's sort of the cutting up of different parts of the body and commodifying it. We'd already talked about this with, the shame economy and makeup and the makeup industry, that kind of thing. Anyway, it's just that in the West, these forms of, commodification is sold as liberation, right? Women are liberated in these forms, and how dare you, a Muslim woman, wear a hijab or whatnot, because you need to be liberated like us. Sorry, I'm going on a rant here, but
Okay.
um, I mean, yeah, I don't know if you had any comments on any aspect of that. Um, Feel free.
Yeah,
I don't.
I'd love
Yeah,
to.
go ahead.
I'd love to respond. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your point?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Take it from here.
great. I'd like to, yeah, first respond to the very important point you made about the violent feminization of Palestinian men. There is a history of feminization of Arab and or Muslim men. If we, look at what happened at Abu Ghraib, for example, which was a U.S. based prison detention. Um, and the men were just essentially they were treated like this feminine other, and there's a lot of violence. I won't get into it, but and of course what happens to uh innocent, really innocent and even non-innocent prisoners who are kept in Guantanamo, for example. So there is definitely a culture of that. There are even women, uh, women officers in these spaces like Abu Ghraib who would kind of take on a more masculine role to impose violence on these men to cause them shame and confusion and almost like an ambivalence, like a splitting in their psyche. So it's really, yeah, it's very, there's a lot of very like harmful examples of the feminization of Arab and Muslim men. So, and I think just to add on as well to the other point that you made about international students and international student labor in Canada, especially South Asian students. I mean, there was this whole uh, there was this whole I forgot what it was called, but there were basically these scam colleges where a lot of students, in Ontario especially, were getting scammed. Their parents were like farmers in Punjab, for example, and sending them to these like colleges, saving up whatever they had. And these people, like these students, these kids were just getting scammed. And it's very difficult, right, to sustain oneself, especially if one comes from a working class family back home. It's really difficult. Like it's so expensive to live here. Like the cost of living is just atrocious, honestly. Like, and a lot of international, female students, they do have to resort to sex work, right? Like, and already sex work, there's there's no legal protection really. And on top of that, you're an international student, so it's even more precarious labor for you. So yeah, I think it's just really like, it's just a very, it's just there's so much, problematics to this. And it's interesting because, Canada, so-called Canada, praises itself as this multicultural, uh, nation state, and a lot of people buy into that. But then, of course, you realize that it's just a facade, for their own nationalism, even though nobody's actually Canadian. Like, there's no legitimate category of a Canadian. Um, but yeah, I think I just wanted to add on to that, and your final point, which was also very important. Um, could you just remind me what it was? I'm sorry, I'm just
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I think you had touched on my comments on the economic side of things. I was also talking about the cultural side of things, music, commodification,
Oh
all these kinds of
yes, oh
things.
my
Yeah.
God. Yes, like so important. Yes, I mean there's definitely this, yeah, there's this, I mean with the, I guess especially with hyper-capitalism, or you could even say almost like a post-capitalist state in the West. Um And with this overconsumption, over commodification that includes women's bodies. I mean, we can take pornography as an example. Like pornography was not as accessible as it is today, maybe not even like 15 years ago. Now it's just, you're not even trying to like look at porn and you end up looking at it somehow, like it's just, and it's really affected an entire generation of not just men but women, but everybody, of women are objectifying and consuming other women's bodies because
And
of
at very young ages. And then like it starts from there and then like, yeah.
exactly. So exactly, yeah. And it becomes such an integral part of your conditioning almost. It's so hard to unlearn unless you consciously do the work to do so. And I think that because, you're seeing these visuals of women being treated like objects, it's not a surprise that so many people in the real world then are going out, or just kind of seeing women as body parts, because that's kind of, like in pornography, the angles, the lighting, the violence of mainstream porn, all of these things, like it just kind of it's so hard to not, see women as, objects that can be consumed and degraded and that focus solely on male pleasure. So that was a really, really, yeah, excellent and important point for sure. And I think we can also see that, again, if I go back to Byung-Chul Han's work, he speaks about this as well, that, you know, um, when you're objectifying women, you're seeing them, okay, he doesn't say this part, but I'm just saying when you objectify women, you're seeing them as subhuman. You're not seeing them as people with their own psyches and their own, you know, subjectivities, their own sexualities. Maybe they're not dressed that way to appease the male gaze. Maybe they're queer. Maybe they don't even care about the male gaze. There are just so many nuances to take into consideration. And what Byung-Chul Han says is that, pornography, for example, it's just voyeurism. It's you're observing other people have sex when, it's reductionist because, sex is an experience. It's not something to be watched like a spectator sport. And then, you're associating your sexuality with that. And I mean, maybe I'll get called out for this, like, but yeah, I have, with I guess with more my own kind of philosophical and feminist, um I guess you could say, leanings, or developments of my own. Like I have become, I am quite anti-pornography. I do have an anti-porn sentiment now.
Yeah, I think those are important points. I don't see why anyone, including yourself, should receive, criticism for that. I mean, um, yeah, we've
Thank
sort of
you. I
gone over.
appreciate that.
I mean, it's tr I mean, yeah, and again, like you can only, I think criticism of that kind of view sometimes comes from a place where it's like, oh, so then what? Like, is a sexually repressive society the way to go? Like, that's like sort of the two extremes of it. But it's definitely more complex than that. And I think
Mhm.
we've gone over some of uh the
But
nuances
it's not
there.
sex. Sorry, I just want to add, it's not
Yeah,
sex. Yeah, at least that's my understanding of it. Because the problem is that in so many societies, such as Pakistan, we can take that as an example, there's no concept of sex education and sexual intimacy. So a lot of, very young children are learning about sex through porn, which it's not sex education. And I think that's a very big I think that's one of the main issues with it, and how accessible it is, especially to young children in that way.
yeah, I think that's a very good point, important point. But yeah, I think, rounding up our conversation here, I think the reason I wanted to talk about this and sort of patriarchy in the West is because I think it's really important that, like, I think maybe here I'm thinking particularly of South Asians and South Asian diaspora because we're very mentally colonized, right? I mean, 2 centuries and more of colonialism, and especially sort of the elite strata or the middle, to upper classes that are then migrating to the West, and some of a lot, a growing portion of that strata of folks in South Asia on the subcontinent as well, is still very much influenced by Western ideology, Western forms of thinking, and then they sort of shape their horizon for all forms of liberation, including patriarchal liberation, by looking toward the West and having these false premises of what patriarchy looks like in the West or the lack of it. And then if you articulate your demands around that by being oriented toward the West, then you don't end up liberating yourself, and you miss how the patriarchy today across the world is primarily informed by like 500 years plus of conquest and Western barbarism, etc. So I think the silver lining here is, like, in our own struggles for liberation, it's um, and particularly as it relates to patriarchy, the West is not the horizon, and Western demands of thinking about patriarchy, cannot be simply copy pasted and adapted. This is really like a tendency of, Indian and South Asian thinking more broadly, very much, the frame of reference is always the West, right? And that's a big issue. Um, yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I think, yeah, no, just to add to that, that I think also I recently wrote an essay called The Horny Post-Colonial Diaspora Conflict, which explores this, this almost like splitting in the psyche of, um, of like a certain archetype of, South Asian man immigrant, um, that is, yeah, torn between cultural sort of, identity and belonging, and this idea of assimilating into the West, and, what kind of shame and almost like, self-violence that causes. And I think that, yeah, like in relation to the West and patriarchy, I mean, we can see that, the incel movement, for example, has taken a lot of traction, particularly with these, right-wing sort of like, male influences. I mean, you have like Andrew Tate, obviously, it's a very popular example. Um, and, there's been like a history of this. kind of, men's rights movements as well, given how, feminism has sort of like evolved over time. And for some reason, a lot of men see it as an attack on them. And there are definitely a lot of feminists who do kind of, uh, enter a misandrous sort of like, territory. And there's a philosopher scholar, Amir Srivastavanan, like she talks about this in her book, The Right to Sex, about this, kind of like the psychology of the incel movement. And she also talks about, uh, pornography as, kind of like philosophy in that it's not, like I was saying earlier, it's not sex education. And it's there's a line that talks about how um, because it's so like, it's just so constructed in a way to be like, hyper stimulating and addictive almost, because it's almost as if how it's, constructed is the, the, I guess, consumer himself is like imagining his semen on her breasts and things like that, right? Like those kinds of different angles and things like that. So she talks about it. It's a really excellent book. Highly recommend. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe last point on that is about how, these industries, whether you think of the traditional porn industry, sort of newer forms of pornography. I mean, these are, very big corporate undertakings. There's profit to be made here. I mean, Zara,
Huge.
you're sitting in, where the headquarters of Pornhub in Montreal. I mean, these are like big
Mind
Western
geek.
institutions. Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go. Yeah. And there's yeah, so I'm drawing the connection again here because it's important, right, to capitalism, and thus, moving beyond capitalism must involve sort of moving beyond this, this mass profit making premised on the commodification of women and their bodies and this kind of thing. Yeah, there's obviously more to be said on that, but I think that's a good place to leave it if you didn't have any further comments. Cool. And yeah, so I mean, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate your time and coming on the podcast. Can you let the listeners know, where they can find your work, how they can plug into um, your online presence, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you as well for having me. This was a really enjoyable discussion. Uh, as far as my work goes, please feel free to find me on Substack. My Substack is called Zero Point. And my full name is Zahra Haider. That's Zahra Haider. But yeah, if you're interested in my work and my writing and for other published work, you'll be able to redirect yourself to my website.
Thanks again so much, Zara.